The roundhouse stood at the edge of a dead railroad town like a broken crown, a great arc of brick and blown-out windows curving around the circle where the turntable lay, and she came to it in the last hour of a gray afternoon, with a storm building black behind her in the west and no other roof in sight. She had followed a lacework of rusted sidings and across the weed-grown yard, past the coaling tower gone to a leaning ruin and the ash pits filled with 100 years of weather, and she had come out at the center of it all, the turntable, and stood at the rim of its great circular pit and looked at the thing the railroad had built to turn its engines around. It was a ring of a pit, 40 yards across, walled in stone, and across the middle of it lay the turntable bridge, a long deep girder that carried a single track and had once carried locomotives, pivoted at its center on a great bearing down in the bottom of the pit, so that an engine run out onto it could be swung around the circle and lined up with any one of the many stall tracks that radiated out from the pit into the arc of the roundhouse like the spokes of a wheel. The bridge lay still across the pit now, rust-red, its track meeting no stall, stopped at some angle it had drifted to years ago and never left, and the whole enormous patient machine of it, the pit and the bridge and the radiating stalls, had the look of a clock the size of a town square that had stopped at an hour no one remembered. She read the place the way she read all such places, by what was left. The stalls in the arc of the roundhouse stood open and dark, their great engine doors long gone, and in the mouths of them she could see the inspection pits between the rails where the men had worked beneath the engines, and the soot of 100 years of locomotives was on the brick of the walls and the underside of the ruined roof, and pigeons went up out of the broken clerestory windows in a clatter when the wind gusted. It had been a place of enormous noise and heat and motion once, the engines coming in tired off the road and going out again clean and fired, the table turning all day and all night, and now it was silent but for the wind and the pigeons. A great dead machine for turning other dead machines, and the storm was climbing the sky behind it black and fast. She was 20 years old, and she carried the whole of what she owned on her back, 30 pounds of it, the folding knife and the matches in the bread bag, and the tin cup, and the candle stub, and the soft notebook with the pencil, and the little under $9 folded in the back that she had not needed to spend in some days. She stood at the rim of the turntable pit with the storm coming up black behind her and looked for the way down into the roundhouse itself, for a dry corner out of the weather in the arc of stalls, and it was while she was looking for the ordinary shelter that she found the extraordinary one, because her eye, going around the pit, caught on the center of it, on the great bearing at the pivot of the bridge, and saw that the bridge did not quite cover its own center. It lay at its drifted angle, and where it lay, a wedge of the pit floor at the very center stood open to the sky, the round stone heart of the pit where the pivot bearing rose, and there, in that wedge of exposed floor at the dead center of the turntable, beside the great bearing, was a hatch. She went down into the pit to reach it. There were iron rungs set in the stone wall of the pit for the men who had tended the bearing, and she climbed down them into the great circular bowl, out of the wind that was beginning to moan across the rim, and she crossed the curved stone floor of the pit to the center, ducking under the deep rust-red girder of the bridge where it lay across her way, feeling the enormous mass of it hang over her as she passed beneath, 100 tons of iron balanced on its bearing a few feet above her head, and she came to the exposed heart of the pit and the hatch beside the bearing. The center of the pit was a raised round stone plinth, the seat of the great bearing, and the bearing itself rose from it, a massive greased column of iron on which the whole bridge turned, and beside it, in the plinth set flush with the stone, was the hatch. It was iron, gone the deep even brown of old rust, and its latch was worn bright in the middle of all that brown by a hand that had used it, and she knew that bright latch now the way you know your own name, and she lifted it, and the hatch came, greased and silent, and cold dry air came up out of it smelling of oil and stone and tallow and old paper, and below it iron rungs went down into a dark chamber beneath the floor of the pit, beneath the very pivot of the turntable, and she looked up once at the black storm, climbing the sky above the rim, and down once into the dark. And she went down, because the storm was coming, and the dark was dry, and she was not the first. The chamber was the pivot vault, the round stone room built beneath the center of the turntable to house the great bearing on which the whole bridge turned, and someone had made it a home. She came down the rungs into it, and stood, and lit her candle, and the light showed her the round dry room, the huge iron column of the pivot rising through the center of it into the pit above where the bridge's whole weight came down and bore and turned, and around that sleeping iron heart fitted into the round of the vault. A life. A bed against the curved stone. A small black stove with its pipe running up and away through a channel bored in the stone. A table, a stool, shelves, a lantern, and the fine even dust of a place shut up a long time lying soft over all of it. It was the deepest-hearted of all the places she had found, a room at the still center of a great turning thing, built around the pivot the way a life is built around the one thing it turns on. She stood a moment and felt the strangeness of where she was, that above her head, a few feet of stone away, hung 100 tons of balanced iron on the very column that ran down through her room, that she had come to rest at the exact center of the great wheel of the turntable, the one point that did not move however the bridge swung, the still heart of the turning, and she thought that a person would have to be a certain kind to want to live there, at the pivot, at the center, and that she thought she knew the kind, because she was beginning to understand that kind herself. And then she got to work, because the work was the thing she did, and the first work was the light and the fire and the reading of the book before she trusted the place with her sleep. She lit the lantern, and the vault came up warm and round and close around the great iron pivot, and on the table, weighted under a smooth stone, there was a book, and she took it up and carried it to the light, and she read it, because the book was the kindness and the book was the rule, and she had learned in a rising tank and a laboring train's smoke and a flooding pier and a burning flue and a whipping wire and a rolling crane never to sleep in a stranger's house without first reading the thing the stranger left to be read, and she was glad, that night of all nights with the storm coming, that she had learned it, because the rule she read was about the storm. He had been the turntable man, the hostler who turned the engines, and he had worked the roundhouse for the whole of his life. He wrote of it in a plain round hand, the work of turning, the engines run out onto the bridge cold or hot, and swung around the circle to their stalls or out to the main, the whole day's traffic of the shed turning across his table, and of how he had loved the balance of the thing above all, the great secret of a turntable, which is that a bridge that carries 100-ton locomotive is balanced so exactly on its center, bearing that a single man, or two, can push it around the full circle by hand, walking it around with a lever at the end. The whole vast weight of it turning at the touch of a person who understands that it is balanced, that it wants to turn, that it is not a thing you lift but a thing you persuade. He had loved that, the enormous mass moving at his hand, because it was balanced, and he wrote of the pride of it, of new men who came to the shed and put their shoulders to the bridge and heaved as if to move a mountain and could not budge it, because they fought it, and of how he would come and set one hand to the lever and walk the great engine around as easy as turning a page, because he did not fight it, and of how they never forgot the first time they saw it, the 100 tons moving at one man's hand. He had built his home in the vault beneath the pivot to be at the very center of the turning, and when the roundhouse closed and the engines went and the shed fell to ruin, he had not gone. Because he could not, he wrote, make himself leave the turntable he had turned for 40 years to seize and rust and be forgotten, and so he had stayed, in the vault beneath the pivot, and kept the bearing greased and the table turning, for no engines and no wage, because the turning was the thing he was. And he wrote about the danger, and it was the balance, the very thing he loved, and he set the rule apart in the middle of a page, with a line ruled above and below the way they all did. The bridge is balanced, and a balanced thing the wind can move. Latch the bridge in the open notch before you go below. Always. Or a blow will walk it around the circle and lay it over the hatch and seal you in, and if ever you are sealed, the table can be turned from within, by the capstan at the pivot, Crank it clear before the pit floods the gear. And do not panic, for it is balanced, and it wants to turn. The drifter girl read that 3 times, and she looked up at the great iron pivot rising through the center of the vault, and she found, set into the base of it, a capstan, a hand drive of gears, and a socket for a bar, the thing the turntable man had rigged so that a person in the vault could turn the great bridge above from below, walking it around by the gears the way he walked it around by the lever above. And she understood the whole terrible sense of it, that the balanced bridge that turned so easily at a hand was a thing the wind could turn just as easily if it was left unlatched, and that a storm could swing the great girder around the circle and lay it across the hatch and seal a person in the vault beneath, and that the way out, then, was to crank the bridge back off the hatch from within, before the storm water filled the pit and drowned the gear. It was the same shape as every rule she had been left, she saw, the danger and the deliverance built of the same thing. The balance that made the table a wonder was the balance that let the wind seal her in, and the balance that let the wind seal her in was the balance that would let her turn herself free. One fact with 2 faces. The way the flood that could drown the pier room was the flood you survived by letting it in. The way the fire that warmed the trestle was the fire that could burn it. The keepers had all learned that, she thought, that the thing that keeps you and the thing that can kill you are so often the same thing, only understood or not understood, and that the whole of the art was the understanding. She marked the rule. And she went up the rungs at once, before anything, up through the hatch into the pit, to latch the bridge in its open notch the way the rule said, because the storm was already booming and she was not going to be sealed in on her first night for want of doing the thing the rule said do first. But the storm was faster than she was, and the latch was the thing that failed her, because it was not there. She came up into the pit, into a wind that had become a gale, the black storm broken over the roundhouse now, rain driving across the rim of the pit, and she went to latch the bridge in its open notch, and found the notch, found the socket in the pit wall where the latch pin should drop to hold the bridge open and clear of the hatch, and found the pin gone, rusted away or fallen down into the pit floor sometime in the 50 years, gone, so that there was nothing to latch the bridge with, nothing to hold it. She stood there with the rain lashing her and her hands going over the empty socket, understanding too slowly what the empty socket meant. That the one thing the rule had told her to do first was the one thing she could not do. That the keeper's own safeguard had rusted out from under her across the years, and left her standing in a rising gale beside 100 tons of unlatched, balanced iron, and even as the understanding came, she felt the wind take the bridge. The great balanced girder, unlatched, unheld, took the gale on its long deep side the way a vane takes the wind, and it began to turn. It began to swing around the circle, slow and enormous and silent under the storm, the whole vast balanced mass of it moving at the push of the wind exactly as it would move at the push of a hand, walking around the pit toward the center, toward the hatch, and she understood in one cold plunge that it was going to lay itself across the hatch and seal the vault, and that she was on the wrong side of the choice, up in the storm with the wind rising, or down in the vault with the way out. It was the hardest reckoning she had ever had to make in the space of a breath, because everything simple in her said stay up, stay in the open, never let yourself be sealed underground with a storm above, and the rule said otherwise. The rule said the vault has a way out and the pit does not, and she had learned by now, in 6 places, to trust the rule over the simple thing, and she did not hesitate. Because hesitating was the thing that killed you, she went down. She went down the hatch into the vault as the great bridge swung toward it, because the rule had told her the vault had a way out and the storm-lashed pit did not. And she came down the rungs and looked up and saw the deep rust-red girders swing across the wedge of gray stormy sky above the hatch and blot it out, and settle there, over the hatch, sealing her in, with a groan of the great bearing that she felt in the stone all around her, and then there was only the lantern and the round vault, and the storm booming muffled above, and the water beginning, already to come. It came down the pit walls and across the pit floor, and to the hatch combing and over it, a cold thin sheet at first, and then a steady run. The storm water filling the great pit above her and finding the one low opening, the sealed hatch and running down around its edges into the vault, down the rungs, spreading across the stone floor toward the capstan at the pivot. She stood at the foot of the rungs for one held breath and looked at it come, the water snaking down out of the dark around the sealed hatch, and she felt the whole animal weight of the fear then, the oldest fear, the sealed in the dark with the water rising fear, the fear that a person is not built to think through, and she felt it try to take her hands and her breath. And she did the thing she had learned to do with it in a tank and a pier and a rolling crane, which was to set it down where she could not feel it and pick up the task instead, because the fear was not the work and the water did not care how afraid she was. She did not watch it come, because watching it come was not the work. The work was the capstan. She found the bar for the socket where it hung on the pivot column, the turntable man having left it exactly to hand, the way they all left the tool exactly to hand, and she set it in the capstan socket and threw her weight on it, and for one sick moment nothing moved. The great bridge dead and still above her, 50 years of stillness in the gear, and then she remembered the rule. Do not panic, for it is balanced, it wants to turn, and she stopped hauling like a person fighting a dead weight, and instead pushed like a person persuading a balanced one, steady, leaning into it, walking it, and the gear took up, and moved, and above her, huge and slow, the great bridge began to turn. It turned off the hatch by inches. She walked the capstan around in the rising water, leaning into the bar, and above her the balanced girder swung slowly back off the wedge of the hatch, and gray stormy light came back down around the edges of it, an inch and then a hand's width and then a slot of sky, and the water was at her boots now and climbing the base of the pivot toward the gear she was turning. And she walked the capstan faster, persuading the great balanced thing around, not fighting it, feeling the truth of the rule in her hands, that it was not a weight to be lifted, but a mass to be coaxed, that it wanted to turn. She found the rhythm of it, the lean and the step and the lean, the great bridge answering her a hand's width at a time. And she did not let the rising water hurry her into fighting the gear, because the moment she fought it, the moment she heaved at it like a dead weight, instead of walking it like a balanced one, it stopped answering. She could feel that it stopped. And so she made herself, with the cold water climbing her shins in the dark, keep the patient walking pace the turntable man had written of, persuade and not fight, and it was the hardest calm she had ever kept, and it was the thing that saved her. The slot of open sky above the hatch widened to a gap, and the gap to the whole wedge, the hatch clear again, the bridge walked back to its open angle, and she jammed the bar through the spokes of the capstan to hold the gear against the wind, and went up the rungs through the open hatch into the storm-filled pit, and out, up the wall rungs, out of the flooding pit onto the rim into the full fury of the storm, alive, soaked, gasping, and turned, and looked back down at the great bridge she had turned off her own grave from beneath, standing again at its open angle with the pit filling below it, and understood that a man 40 years dead had built a way for her to turn herself free, had known the wind would someday do exactly this, and had rigged the capstan against exactly this. A hand reached across all that time to give her the turning of the thing that would have sealed her, and she stood in the storm and shook, and it was the rain on her face, and not only the rain. She waited the storm out in the arc of the roundhouse, in a dry stall, wrapped in her own blanket with her back to the sooty brick, watching the rain drive across the pit and the great bridge stand at its open angle where she had cranked it, and she did not sleep much, because the fright was still in her and would not settle, but she was dry and she was out and she was alive, and toward morning the storm blew itself away east and the sky cleared to a washed pale blue. In the morning the pit had drained through its old sumps and the vault below was wet but whole, and she went down and dried it out and set it right, and the first thing she did, before she dried a single blanket, before she so much as lit the stove, was to make a latch. She forged a new pin from a bar in the turntable man's stores. heating it in the stove's firebox and working it to shape against an old rail she used for an anvil, and set it in the socket in the pit wall, and she latched the bridge in its open notch. And she stood and looked at the latched bridge and the open hatch, and knew that the wind would not walk the table over her again, that she had mended in a morning the one thing whose failing had nearly killed her, the rusted-out safeguard the keeper had trusted and time had taken, and she understood that this too was part of the keeping, that a place handed down across 50 years would have things worn out of it that had to be made new, and that the making new was hers to do now, her share of the long keeping. Then she took up her notebook and wrote the rule first. Before anything, the way she had come to do, latch the bridge in the open notch before you go below. Always, if sealed, crank it clear from the capstan before the pit floods. It is balanced. It wants to turn. She underlined it twice. And below it she wrote a second line. He turned engines 40 years and left me the turning of my own way out. She looked at that a while. Then she went on. The days took on a shape. She stopped counting them. She kept the vault, and she kept the turntable, greasing the great bearing the way the turntable man had greased it, keeping the capstan free and the new latch pin bright, and she came to do the turning herself, for no engines, as he had, walking the great balanced bridge around the circle at her hand in the evenings for the plain wonder of it. 100 tons moving at the push of one girl, because it was balanced, the whole enormous thing turning silent and smooth across the pit under the sky, and she understood, turning it, the joy that had kept him. The way a great mass that moves at your touch makes you feel briefly that you have understood something true about the world, that force is nothing and balance is everything, that the way to move an impossible weight is not to be strong, but to find its center. She learned to walk the bridge to any stall she chose and line its track up true with the stall track, the way he had lined engines up 10,000 times, though there were no engines and no stalls that wanted feeding, and she did it for the skill of it, for the keeping of the skill alive, and she got so she could stop the great bridge dead on its mark to the inch, and was as proud of that quiet, useless accuracy as she had been of anything. She latched the bridge every time before she went below. Always, without fail, the rule so deep in her now, it was not a rule but a part of her hands. She swept the vault and oiled the bearing and drew her water from a clean run she found in the Roundhouse stores that the shed had piped from a spring, and she cleared the pit sumps so a storm would drain and never feel again, mending that second danger too, and she left untouched the small things that had been the turntable man's. Out of the courtesy she paid all of them. She never learned the whole of him. She did not expect to. But she came to know the shape of his mind by turning his table and keeping his bearing and living in the vault at the still center of the turning, and she thought that he had understood a thing most people never understand, the secret of the balanced weight, that you do not fight the great mass, but persuade it, that the center is where the power is and not the edge, and that he had built his whole home and his whole last life at the center, at the pivot, at the one still point of the turning thing, and had kept it turning to the end for no engines and no wage, because the turning was the thing he was. She thought, too, of the thing he had done that none of the other keepers had quite done, which was to give her not just a warning but a way out, not just the rule that said the danger is the balance, but the capstan that let the balance save her. A keeper who had foreseen the exact shape of the death that would come for whoever followed him and had built, with his own hands, the means of their escape from it, and left it greased, and to hand across 50 years for a stranger he would never meet. They had all been kind, the keepers, in the cold hard way of people who leave a rule for those who come after. But he had been kind in a warmer way, had reached further, had not only named the trap but built the door, and she loved him for it. The turntable man, more than she had expected to love a set of pencil lines. And the drifter girl, turning it now, keeping it now, understood him, the way she had come to understand all of them, and understood by now, past any doubting that these places were not chance, that a girl who comes in out of the storm to the dead centers of the world's forgotten machines is exactly the person the keepers had kept their bearings greased and their capstans free for. The one who would come at the last and read the rule and take up the turning, and not let the great balanced thing seize into the ground. On an evening in the turning of the year, she sat in the vault beneath the pivot by the ticking stove with the lantern lit, and the turntable man's ledger closed under its stone, and her own notebook open on her knee. The great iron pivot rising through the center of the round room into the pit above where the bridge stood, latched in its open notch, the hatch clear. The pin she had forged bright in its socket. Earlier that evening, before the light went, she had gone up and walked the great bridge once around the full circle for the pleasure of it. Standing at the lever end and setting one hand to it, and walking the 100 tons around under the last of the sky, and she had stopped it dead on the mark of a stall track, true to the inch, and had stood a while in the quiet with her hand on the balanced iron, feeling it want to move and holding it still, and had thought that of all the things the keepers had taught her this was the strangest and maybe the truest, that the way to be equal to an impossible weight is not to grow strong enough to lift it, but to understand it well enough to persuade it, to find the center where it turns. She was 20 years old. She had a folding knife, a box of matches, a tin cup, and a little under $9 she had not spent, and now had nowhere to spend and did not miss. She had a home in the vault at the pivot of a great turntable, a bed in the curve of its stone, a stove and clean water, and a bearing she kept greased, a capstan that had turned her free of her own grave, and a latch she had forged so it never would need to again, and a book she had not written full of the man who had taught her that the way to move the world is to find its center. She turned to a fresh page and smoothed it flat with the side of her hand, and above her the great balanced bridge stood latched and safe over the drained and quiet pit, turning for no one now but her, at her hand, in the evenings, for the wonder of it. And she began to write, in the plain round hand she was learning from a turntable man 40 years dead. The first line of the keeping of the only home she had ever made her own.